it's interesting. You had a lot of critics from the West yourself, but other outspoken Singaporean scholars and former politicians like Mr. George Yeo, even President Tarman himself, they've been speaking of a different approach to China and advice for the U.S. and the West that they don't like very much. So why is it that in Singapore there are so many prominent advocates and almost in Western eyes apologists for China than any other country, it seems? Why do you think that is?
Well, I think the Singaporeans who speak out on the U.S.-China contest are not doing so because they are pro-China and anti-U.S. In fact, it's very clear that Singapore is a friend of both China and the U.S. And you know, the main argument of my book, Has China Won?, is that the U.S. cannot succeed in stopping China's growth. So a wiser approach would be for U.S. to work with China. And clearly that message is appreciated by the more thoughtful members of the American establishment. And what Singapore is trying to do is to reach out to the more thoughtful members of the American establishment, which is why they're one of the few leaders to come out very openly, very early, to say that my country will not take sides in the U.S.-China contest, was the former Prime Minister of Singapore. You know, he gave a speech in the Shangri-La Dialogue. He wrote an article in the magazine Foreign Affairs explaining that Singapore wants to be friends with China and friends with the U.S. And increasingly, more and more countries are echoing the message of Singapore. Certainly the ASEAN countries are echoing the message of Singapore, that we want to be friends with the United States, we want to be friends with China, and we don't want to choose, you know. But unfortunately, there's some people in the United States who think that the ASEAN countries can be forced to choose. And the people who believe that, again, show that they have no long-term strategic thinking. You know, at the end of the day, if you're asking Southeast Asian countries to choose, they know that the United States will be around in Southeast Asia for the next 100 years. But China will be around for the next 1,000 years. So it's be foolish for any Southeast Asian nation to alienate China or to join a campaign against China. So therefore, this is part of it's a reflection of the broader point I'm trying to make. It shows the lack of a comprehensive long-term strategy by United States against China.
For top Singaporean policymakers, political leaders, and leading thinkers, I think that attitude has been very consistent for decades. Whether it was Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew himself and his successors, all the way till the current Prime Minister, the message always seemed to be clear. But for other ASEAN members, things might be more, tumultuous. Changes a lot. What do you think for ASEAN as a whole? Do you think that position will continue to hold for the next 10 to 15 years in this timeline?
I think for ASEAN as a whole, I have no doubts. And certainly, for example, the most important member of ASEAN is the most populous state in ASEAN, and they've just elected a new President-elect Prabowo. And in fact, the President-elect Prabowo has actually invited me to go to Jakarta several times to speak to members of his incoming team. And when I say that it's in ASEAN's interest not to take sides, most of them seem to agree with my message. And he'll be around. He'll be the leader of Indonesia possibly for the next 5 to 10 years. And Malaysia also, Prime Minister Anwar Ibrahim has made it very clear he wants to be friends of the United States and he wants to be friends with China. So most ASEAN countries are relatively consistent. The one country that seems to be somewhat inconsistent is Philippines. Yes. Because it's sort of strange. You have one president, Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, who's pro-China, and then you have President Aquino, who's pro-US, and then you have President Duterte, who's pro-China. Then you have President Marcos now, who seems to be, I don't know, seems to be pro-US. Now, that's a bit unwise on the part of the Philippines to have its foreign policy swing like a pendulum. It's very important for the states of Southeast Asia to show long-term strategic discipline and to work out a policy, and the policy we don't take sides, and then stick to it, come what may, to stick to it. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think is sometimes missing in the Philippines. And I feel sorry for the Philippines, because it'd be wiser for the Philippines to adopt a policy that will continue regardless of who's president. And the same balance that other ASEAN states have made is something I think Philippines can also achieve.
Right. And this current confrontation between China and the Philippines in the South China Sea, where do you see that leading? Could that become a flashpoint that could lead to a disaster?
So any time naval vessels, fortunately it's not Navy vessels but Coast Guard vessels, actually physically crash against each other, you're creating very dangerous moments. So I would say whatever can be done to avoid direct collisions should be done. And I think it's an interesting question to ask is that why were there no collisions at all when President Duterte was president? I mean, he, in his own way, was also quite firm and tough about the claims made by Philippines, you know. So this issue will not be resolved through military means. At the end of the day, it will be resolved through some kinds of negotiations. And that's why, as you know, ASEAN is working very hard to complete the code of conduct on the South China Sea. It's difficult, but it can be done. And it's something that you should focus on doing, focus on finding a negotiated solution. And frankly, China as the big power can afford to be generous in these negotiations, as China has sometimes been in its negotiations, like say with Russia and so on and so forth. Right. So there are ways and means of resolving these issues.
And among ASEAN members, Malaysia and Vietnam also have territorial disputes over the South China Sea against China, but things on those fronts seem to be managed much better than with the Philippines.
Yeah.
Why do you think that is?
Well, I think the Vietnamese are in some ways the wisest people in Southeast Asia when it comes to managing China, because they have handled China for 2,000 years. If I'm not mistaken, they were occupied by China for 1,000 years. And the Vietnamese have a saying that says that to become a leader of Vietnam, you must be able to stand up to China, and you must be able to get along with China. If you cannot do both, you cannot become a leader of Vietnam. So the Vietnamese understand that they have to live with China for the next 1,000 years. So you have to work out a balance. You cannot be completely confrontational, nor can it be completely kowtowing also. I mean, if Vietnam kowtows completely to China, it would lose all its national pride, its people will revolt, and so on and so forth. So it can be done to maintain a balance in this thing. And I think the important thing is to do it now, while China is still the number 2 power in the world. Because when China becomes the number 1 power in the world and a much more assertive leader becomes a leader of China, then that will make life more difficult for the countries that haven't worked out their arrangements with China.
Now, ASEAN is the biggest trading partner with China. What kind of economic and political dynamics do you think that will bring to the next 10 to 15 years? A lot of Western countries don't seem to have realized that this trade dynamic has turned. Are there risk factors that could reverse this, or do you think this will be relatively stable going forward?
In trade, there will always be ups and downs. There's never a straight line.
Right.
I think we should be ready for that. But nonetheless, the increase in trade also reflects the increase in consumer markets in the region. One statistic which I use all the time is that the largest growth of middle-class populations in the world is taking place in what I call the CIA countries. CIA is not Central Intelligence Agency. CIA is China, India, and ASEAN. And there are about 3.5 billion people who live in ASEAN, 1.4 billion in China, 1.4 billion in India, close to 700 million in ASEAN, 3.5 billion. Now out of these 3.5 billion people, there were only 150 million people enjoying middle class living standards in 2000. But by 2020, the number had exploded from 150 million to 1.5 billion. Increase of 10 times in 20 years. And by 2030, it could reach 2.5 to 3 billion. So this is where the future growth of middle classes is happening. This is where the growth in consumption is happening. So that's why it's very important for United States and Europe to recognize that they should try to work out long-term cooperative arrangements with the ASEAN countries. And so when trade is growing between ASEAN and China, it is unwise for United States or Europe to come and tell ASEAN, why aren't you standing up to China? I mean, that's absurd. Mm-hmm. We want to grow our economies, and if we can grow with China, we will grow with China. And we want to grow with the United States too. By the way, the United States at the same time is the largest investor in Southeast Asia, in ASEAN. In fact, the United States has invested more in ASEAN than it has in China, Japan, South Korea, and India combined. That's shocking. So the region, therefore, is attractive to both China and the United States.
ASEAN itself is such a diverse gathering of countries. We talked about some of the major economies, but some of the economically smaller countries like Cambodia, Myanmar, the Laos, China have also pretty complex relations with them. For example, this canal that China is helping Cambodia build that will connect its main waterways to its main seaport. That seems to have ruffled some feathers in Vietnam as well. So such developments that China has with these economically smaller members of the ASEAN, do you think that will potentially lead to suspicion or skepticism in other parts, or if we could call it mainstream ASEAN?
I mean, there will always be some projects that may cause discomfort to neighbors and so on and so forth. But at the same time, even if Vietnam may be uncomfortable, let's say with the canals in Cambodia, there's no question that Vietnam has now agreed to build a fast train between Hanoi and Kunming.
Right.
Now that's a really big deal. I mean, it's quite stunning that two countries that had a major war as recently as 1979 are now going to have a completely peaceful border with a fast train going between the two countries, right? That's a sign of how amazing Southeast Asia is. One of the things that many people in the West, and frankly to some extent also many people in China don't appreciate, is that ASEAN is a genuine miracle. Because we live in a world, as you know, where people are fighting. Russians and Ukrainians are culturally very similar. Slavic people, they're fighting each other. Palestinians and Israelis, similar people. Actually, they're both Semites, fighting each other, right? So here in Southeast Asia, you have more diversity than anywhere else in the world. Out of 700 million people, you have 250 million Muslims, 150 million Christians, 150 million Buddhists, Mahayana Buddhists, Hinayana Buddhists, Taoists, Confucianists, Hindus, and communists too in Southeast Asia. And we are at peace. So there is something that ASEAN does that is very special. We have created a DNA of pragmatism. And we believe in two Indonesian words, musyawarah and mufakat, which means consultation and consensus. So the fact that we've been able to keep ASEAN peaceful and at the same time make ASEAN prosperous is quite remarkable. In the years 2010 to 2020, in the 10 years, ASEAN added more to global economic growth than the European Union did. which is amazing, even though the European Union has got a much bigger economy. So there are things that ASEAN is doing that are truly special in our world. And this is something that I think both the United States and China should recognize. The most important statistic everyone should know is that only 12% of the world's population lives in the West. 88% lives in the rest of the world, the global South. And even though what ASEAN has done is not appreciated by the West, in fact, the European Union continues to be stupidly condescending towards ASEAN, even though ASEAN has outperformed the European Union because we haven't had a Brexit within ASEAN. But in the global South, there is a lot of appreciation of the fact that ASEAN is teaching the world how different countries can get along with each other. And if you're looking for a model of regional cooperation in the global South, no one comes close to ASEAN. No one. And they understand that. Africans understand that. The Latin Americans understand that. And certainly South Asia can't even have regular summits among its leaders in the way that ASEAN countries have regular summits twice a year among all the ASEAN leaders, you know. So what ASEAN has done has actually been understood by the global South, but not necessarily by the West. And in the case of the comparison between ASEAN and China, it's easier for ASEAN to get its message across because ASEAN doesn't threaten anybody.
Right.
ASEAN is by definition a weak organization, loose organization. It's not a threat. Whereas China has become so big that sometimes some countries perceive China as a threat, and therefore it's harder for China to sell this message. But nonetheless, China shouldn't stop. Should continue. For example, you know, the Chinese have been promoting this concept of dialogue of civilizations. That's a worthwhile concept. It should continue to pursue it, even if there is resistance initially from the Americans and the Europeans.
Yes.